It's wonderful to be back at the University of Arkansas. Like Chris mentioned, I taught in our education program in 2021 to 2020 to 2021, that year of COVID. So returning to see faces and gathering in person really means a lot, and it's so special. I want to thank Dr. Chris Schulte for inviting me to speak as part of the 2026 Center for the Study of Childhood Art Speaker Series. Like he mentioned, I am the Associate Director of the Center, so it kind of feels like getting invited to your own family reunion, kind of special and awkward in the same way, but I'm so happy to be here. Before I begin, I thought I would just talk a little bit about what my work has been so far. As a researcher, I've been interested in childhood art since meeting my mentors, Dr. Christine Thompson and Chris Schulte at Penn State, where I earned my grad degrees. I've been particularly focused on the politics of childhood art, exploring tensions between children and adults, children and their peers, and children and the social world they inhabit. Over the past 10 years, I've been privileged to be invited to spaces like museum-based preschool, university-affiliated early childhood centers, and community-based programs like Saturday art schools to spend time with children and conduct research. I've primarily used ethnographic research methods in curricular spaces, engaging with children through the everyday processes of playing, making art, and simply just being together. So today I'll share one of my recent works on children's spatial belonging, examining the no-kid zones in art museums, and in relation to the politics of childhood art. I want to explore how these two areas allow us to think differently about children's artistic practices in the social world. So today I'll start with a short vignette that reflects on an encounter in 2023 in Seoul, South Korea. The ginkgo leaves were just beginning to turn along the stone walls of Gyeongbokgung Palace that Saturday in late October. I was teaching that semester at my institution's branch campus in the Seoul metropolitan area, a city I had left years ago but never fully, and I planned a field trip to the National Museum of the Modern and Contemporary Art for my undergraduates. I arrived an hour early with an intention to visit other museums and galleries nearby. The gallery district spread out around me. Narrow streets lined with white cube spaces, their glass fronts revealing fragments of installations I would never have time to see. Then I spotted the museum I had heard about more than a decade ago, but had never entered. Inside, the first floor was dim, almost cave-like. My eyes adjusted slowly, searching for the admissions board near the entrance. When I found it, what stopped me was a statement printed both in Korean and English. Children under 10 may not enter due to safety reasons, as seen in the photo here. In Korean, the tone was harsher. Less explanation, more command. Children under 10 are not allowed. So this kind of language that doesn't invite questions. Korea's no-kid zone had multiplied over the past decade. Coffee shops with signs in their windows, restaurants with age restrictions printed on their menus. But this was an art museum, a major one, featuring works of Nam June-paik, Damien Hirst, Cindy Sherman, Keith Haring, and many other well-known artists. I asked a staff member at the desk, "Is it true children under 10 cannot enter?" And she said yes. So she spoke softly, almost apologetically. The space is very tight, very dark, and some of the artwork, it can be disturbing. We worry children will be frightened. I asked, what if the parents want to bring them? A pause. If the parents insist and they pay the admission, we allow it, but we recommend they don't. The sign lingered in my thoughts. It suggested not merely a precaution, but boundary. An idea of who belongs in spaces of culture and who does not. This wasn't an isolated encounter. What I found in Seoul reflects a broader pattern of spatial restriction affecting children globally. Near where I live in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, a large private museum does not permit visitors under the age of 12, as seen in the picture here, despite the vast indoor and outdoor space they offer. I encountered this policy during a visit last summer, another instance of the same quiet declaration. Children are not welcome here. The broader adults-only movement originating in the Mediterranean tourism has expanded. Nearly 1,600 hotels worldwide are now adult-only, twice the number in 2016. During the COVID-19 pandemic, children were unable to play at playgrounds, which might have served as a social alternative to school, as they were deemed disease vector by officials. A major civic space like Chicago's Millennium Park is known for one of the finest urban playgrounds in the country. Yet, in the summers of 2022, 23, and 24, a curfew was imposed on teenagers after 6 p.m. Many shopping malls also reinstated parental escort policies post-pandemic. In neither case did those in power establish an alternative space at scale for children and teens to gather. Contemporary public space is increasingly organized around children's absence rather than their presence. This restriction is not accidental, but carefully designed, reflecting deeper ideologies about childhood, competence, and control. Just as childhood art has never really been about children or about their art, but rather about adult values and interests, children's access to public spaces has never been about children or their freedom, but about adult comfort, adult aesthetics, and adult authority. I would argue that understanding restriction, both spatial and epistemological, is central to reimagining more liberatory possibilities for childhood art education. And even in spaces where children are allowed, are they truly welcome? Are they recognized as legitimate participants in the sensible order of that space? Or are they permitted to be present while their engagement is circumscribed by adult expectations, developmental frameworks, and aesthetic norms? Today, I'd like to talk about how the politics of childhood art and spatial belonging operate across a spectrum, from outright exclusion to belonging, with subtle regulation often working in between, and how points along this spectrum reveal the ways children are positioned as having no part in spaces of art. Understanding this spectrum, I will argue, opens up possibilities for emancipatory practices in childhood art and pedagogy. To understand how restriction operates, we first need to examine the temporal logic that makes seem natural. Childhood can be understood as a constructed category that only makes sense within the framework of imagined, normatively segmented life courses. The assumption that human lives unfold through discrete chronological stages of development. Rather than reflecting a natural or universal reality, this temporal framing operates as a political logic that privileges certain modes of existence over others. Elizabeth Freeman describes the dominant temporal order as chrononormativity, a system in which time is imagined as linear, progressive, sequential, and universal, an arrangement shaped by histories of colonialism and capitalist expansion. Chrononormativity governs how lives, social worlds, and histories are structured and interpreted, enacted as event-centered, goal-oriented, intentional, and culminating in epiphanies or major transformations. It is this logic, not biology alone, that binds children to adults' constructions of them as predetermined, incomplete human beings. Of course, the analysis of children's biological development has yielded considerable knowledge about the common changes young people experience over time. But using age as a defining marker for this change often engenders restrictions on children's activities, neglecting the child's capacity for agency. As Carla Rinaldi writes, the image of the child has been, quote, a cultural and therefore social and political convention that makes it possible to recognize or not certain qualities and potential in children, end quote. Conceptualizations of children have long been regulated by adult power and interests, resulting in forms of oppression and injustice that are deeply ingrained in children's everyday life. Children's belonging in spaces of art exists within what I call a regime of restriction, a constellation of practices, policies, and epistemologies that constrain what children can do, where they can be, and how their creative expressions are understood. This regime operates through two interconnected mechanisms: spatial restriction, the physical exclusion from museums, parks, and public spaces described earlier, and epistemological restriction, the developmental frameworks that categorize, predict, and normalize children's creative expression. These restrictions are justified through adult fantasies about childhood, romanticized notions of innocence requiring protection, or deficit models positioning children as incompetent adults requiring intervention. Whether excluding children from museums to quote-unquote protect artworks or analyzing their drawings through developmental stages to quote-unquote understand their psychology, adults maintain control over both children's bodies and the meaning of their creative work. The history of childhood art education reveals these restrictions. Lowenfeld's stage theory assumed predictability and universality in the artistic development, and the Goodenow-Harris Straw Person test reduced creative expression to intelligence measurement. While claiming to honor development, these frameworks restricted understanding by forcing diverse expressions into predetermined categories, what Cannella identifies as colonization of early childhood education. When we sort children's drawings into stages, assess their quote-unquote readiness, or diagnose development through art, we enact epistemological restriction mirroring the spatial restrictions of no-kid zones. Both say, children don't belong here, in this space, in this way of knowing, until they conform to adult expectations. These frameworks aren't abstract. They operate daily in children's social spaces. So when the staff at the museum I visited in Seoul shared the rationale of the restriction of No Kid Zone, she mentioned that tight, dark corridors could threaten children's bodies and provocative artworks threaten their innocence. Even though some institutions might have legitimate reasons for excluding children and others, it is still part of an alarming exclusionary trend with cultural spaces. The prevalent myths and misconceptions about children often leave us with a limited understanding of young visitors in art museums, portraying them as either too innocent or insufficiently competent to engage meaningfully with art. First, in thinking about competence, I would say that the accidents occur regardless of age. Accidents such as children breaking an art piece or damaging a painting. An adult accidentally actually shattered Jeff Koons' sculpture at a Miami art fair a few years ago, and more revealing cases are intentional adult destruction. In 2023, a college student at 8 Maurizio Catalan's banana installation at Seoul Liu Museum, later claiming this act itself was constituted artwork. The same year, activists splashed paint on a Monet painting to protest climate change. Children's accidental interactions generate blanket exclusions, while adults' deliberate destruction is framed as protest or performance. What becomes clear is that museum exclusion operates through what French philosopher Jacques Rancière calls the police order, determining which bodies belongs where, whose presence is legitimate, and who has a part in cultural life. These aren't neutral safety measures, but political arrangements distributing access along lines of age. Rancière writes, "The police is thus first an order of bodies that defines the allocation of ways of doing, ways of being, and ways of saying, and sees that those bodies are assigned by name to a particular place and task. It is a particular order of the visible and the sayable that sees that a particular activity is visible and another is not, that this speech is disclosure and another is noise." As the power of the police defines the ways of doing and being, bodies in educational institutions, namely museums, are also expected to operate by the police order. The presence of police materializes in various forms at museums, such as the selected artworks displayed, curricula of programs, expected rules, and of course, who gets to enter the space. Accordingly, by these police sense, the spectators' bodies become assigned to a particular place and task, which is distributed to suggest that particular aesthetics and performances are acceptable in the space. The police order, or the social order, is founded on what Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. Police, in this sense, is a particular distribution of the sensible that defines the territory one should occupy and the accordingly expected activity of the allocated position. None of the motivations mentioned above to protect the child's innocence or to protect the artwork from children's assumed incompetence seem to qualify as a valid rationale for the museums to employ such an exclusionary policy. It is a deliberate choice that they make to express the presence of superior power, not "we must anyhow," but "we want to," for the convenience of the superior power. Museums' mission can still be achieved without this form of coercion. Rancière's elaboration of relinquishing power for an emancipatory pedagogy suggests that we consider if museums identify with possessing the superior power. In thinking about innocence, I would omit some of the work on display needed adult guidance, such as works included Scottish artist Douglas Gordon's Making of Monster, in which the artist's face becomes grotesque through the application of transparent adhesive tapes, and British artist Mark Quinn's Self, a work made by casting the artist's head using 4.5 liters of his own blood. While these works may be provocative, often it is the adults' misconceptions of children's innocence that are considered to be at risk. The 18th and 19th century discourse of the innocent child has become foundational to contemporary child-centered education. This romanticized notion depicts the child as being in a naive state, free from moral guilt, and considers childhood recognizable through encouragement, assistance, support, and facilitation. As Christine Thompson has observed, the innocence of children is defined rhetorically, if inconsistently, through the endless series of moral panics. While children becoming independent is praised, adults feel alarmed when seeing children unsupervised. These reactions point to an understanding of children as incapable, inevitably marked as disadvantage, and as risk of error and exploitation. The practice of no kids zone museums falls into the idea of policing children's innocence and competence. Policing children's innocence in museums may look like censoring the content of the artworks on behalf of children, determining that certain artworks are child-friendly while others are not appropriate to view at all. In other words, children are regarded as vulnerable, innocent, and helpless when exposed to artworks that adults deem violent, sexually suggestive, or simply too provocative. Similarly, policing the competence of children has long prevailed in forms of limiting children's engagement with the artworks. Children are not intelligent or experienced enough to perform in the museum in an acceptable manner. These decisions constructed by the police order primarily derive from the developmental perspectives that have long prevailed in the field of psychology and education and are now imbued in every corner of cultural institutions and public spaces around the world. Museums defending exclusion deploy rationales rooted in two persistent ideologies: romanticized innocence and presumed incompetence, as I mentioned. The notion that children require protection from distributing content reflects centuries-old discourse positioning children as naive and morally pure. Simultaneously, linking appropriate behavior to chronological age reflects developmental psychology's emphasis on children's incompetence, immaturity, and dependency. Despite research showing even young children demonstrate moral competence and decision-making capacity. Now I would like to go back to my research on children's art. I've come to understand that childhood art is inherently political because children always work within tensions between their desires and adult expectations. I've centered my thoughts alongside Rancière's conception on politics as disruption, moments when part of those who have no part challenge the social order excluding them. Distinct from the dictionary definition of politics, the governmental practice or the struggle for power, Rancière's idea of politics is a configuration of a specific space, of those positioned as common and as pertaining to a common sense, and of arguments about such decision-making. Politics exists in opposition to police, a set of distributed order in our world that tend to partition bodies on an alleged consensus. Rancière argues that the order of things we deem natural in the society is determined by a police order, which is linked to an aesthetic regime. Rancière's notion of the police manifests in this painting event I encountered in a kindergarten classroom, where the teacher instructed them to paint small dots inside the lines to practice pointillism as inspired by George Seurat's work. And I'll read another vignette of the painting event. Having the boys and myself gathered around the table, the teacher, Miss Carla, carefully paints a few dots at the corner of the canvas using a thin paintbrush. The dots are small and in different colors too. Attentive to Seurat's method, she demonstrates how the dots should be painted close to each other without being mixed, and that the size and the colors of the circles could vary. After Miss Carla leaves the art table, Oliver and Brian, sitting across from each other, began to paint dots on the canvas, rendering different sizes of circles. With his paintbrush carefully touching the surface of the canvas, Brian says, "Look how tiny my dot is. You can't even see it." Oliver draws a circle close to 1 inch in diameter, bigger than the circles Miss Carla had drawn. Then he asked me, "Can you see that?" I reply, "That's a huge one." Oliver's tone rises with excitement. "Oh no, that's a huge, huge, huge one." The boys are laughing, singing, and making unidentifiable noises together while delineating bigger shapes of black dots over the diagonal lines. As they proceed, different colors of paint begin to touch the boys' hands and smocks. Brian recognizes the paint marks covered on his hand. Shortly after, Miss Carla redirects them to be in control with the paint, and the boys resume painting big black dots. Oliver discontinues the whirling of the paintbrush, saying, "When you walk Then Brian confirms, oh no, Miss Carla's close to us. Now Miss Carla is actually walking towards the art table. When Miss Carla approaches the table, Greg, who later joined the activity, carefully asks her, As Miss Carla walks away, in a lower voice, Oliver notes, I messed up the pattern like that, which to me seemed like a confident claim to make, especially among his peers. At this moment, I quietly asked the boys, so why did you guys think Miss Carla wouldn't like the big dots? Brian responds, she actually said she did. I asked why he thought she wouldn't like it before that, which Oliver answered, because they are so big and the other ones are not, because it's out of the lines. I find multiple layers of tensions inherent in the painting event. Tensions between the adult's instruction and the children's own pleasure, between children's assigned duty and the desired performativity, and between the proper use of given materials and experimented methods of engaging with human and non-human materials. These tensions materialize into bodily movements and verbalizations by which political subjects extract themselves from the dominant partitions of their identification and classification. For example, Oliver's exhilarated utterances of, I messed up the pattern like that, and because it's out of the lines, as well as Brian calling his painted hands bad hands, suggest that their reconfiguration of the dominant distribution of the sensible, the renditions, was a deliberate deviation from the assigned rules and boundaries. The assumed identity as empty operators having no title in the police order was subverted upon Oliver and Brian's intentional dissensus as they voiced themselves to challenge the given rules and of doing and being. The kindergartners lingered with the tensions that arose as they removed themselves from the naturalness of a place and the identity expected to follow instructions ordered by the adults. Importantly, it is neither my intention to demonize art educators who subscribe to a particular set of aesthetic standards and instructional methods, nor my project to criticize Ms. Carla's response. In fact, in this event, Ms. Carla did not disapprove the boys' out-of-the-line painting, although she did initially assign a project that aligned with prescribed styles and representation approaches to art making. She did not enforce it at all. The point is that Oliver and Brian certainly expected her to do so, assuming that the disobedience to the distributive rules and roles would result in unpleasant consequences, as seen in calling her their painted hand bad hands and the other worrisome statements. This assumption is what I focus on complicating. Those assumptions are what I consider policing as well. The boys' assumption that the rules would be enforced and any resistance to them will not be tolerated. I would like to bring these two cases into conversation, the No Kid Zone and the painting event, thinking about how the policing operates across scales. At one end of the spectrum, children are excluded from the space entirely. The No Kid Zone signs in the police order at its most explicit. It determines who is visible and who is rendered invisible, who is a spectator and who is not. The policing, or what Rancière would call the distribution of the sensible, is enacted as a physical exclusion. At the other hand, the children are inside the space. They are physically present in the kindergarten classroom, but their engagement is circumscribed by adult expectations, developmental frameworks, and aesthetic norms. The pre-painted diagonal lines, the small dots demonstrated by Ms. Carla, the expectation of the orderly, controlled art making. Here, the police order is subtler. but it is no less operative. The policing lives in the curriculum, in the materials, in the spatial arrangement, and most strikingly, in what the children have already internalized. If Oliver and Brian going out of the lines was a political act, it made me wonder what politics might look like if we were to challenge the explicit spatial restriction that constrains children's and teens' mobility in museums, parks, playgrounds, and public spaces. In considering the restrictions children face in daily life, I find artist Hugh Haydon's work resonating with the contemporary moment in ways that theory alone cannot capture. In 2022, Haydon showcased Briar Patch, a total of 100 wooden elementary school style desks that erupt with tree branches, cohering into tangled assemblies with layered meanings. The accumulation of desks summons the grid arrangement of classroom seating, referencing folklore traditions from around the world. The work draws on the notion of the briar patch as a place protected for some and dangerous for others, a spatial condition that maps directly onto disparities within the educational system. This particular piece reminded me of Oliver and Brian going out of the lines, challenging the restrictions despite the risks they could face. In his 2024 work, Brush, Haydon created a replica of Kidsville, a suburban Dallas example of the wooden playgrounds that flourished in the 1980s. The piece represented for the artist the third space where people might gather, the first being home, the second or school or work, and the third a park or community space. Soft brushes attached to the wooden structure allude to other informal gathering places like barber shops. The work summons the ambivalent history of children's spaces, pointing to a place where the adult world tries to reach in and reorganize children's lives. Haydon's childhood-themed sculptures embody the idea of, quote, attractive nuisance, a legal term for dangerous condition on an owner's property that may attract children, typically invoked to have structures taken down. As Lang writes, art gets to play by different rules. Haydon's work references childhood tales, childhood places, and childhood fears through the juxtaposition of materials and art historical friction, creating cognitive friction. What Haydon reveals is that playgrounds, like art museums, were never neutral spaces of childhood freedom. The more we examine the invention of public parks and playgrounds, the more we see exclusions based on race, class, gender, baked into their design. In the case of museums, many of course do include children, but it is worth noting that, at least in the United States, the children we most often see in museums are white and from middle-class families, mirroring the demographics of adult visitors. Historically, museums have excluded socially and economically underrepresented groups, quote, not by accident, but by design, end quote. The adult world, as Haydon's works suggest, constantly tries to reach in and reorganize children's lives, determining not only where children can play, but how play should look, what it should accomplish, and which children deserve access. So today I have tried to show that the politics of childhood art and spatial belonging operate across a spectrum. At the one end, No Kid Zone signs renders children invisible in spaces of cultural production. At the other, the internalized police order renders children's own art practices self-censored before any adult has even intervened. What connects them is the distribution of a sensible, a social order founded on persistent myths about children's innocence and competence. But I also like to focus on the possibilities today. Children are already political subjects, as Oliver and Brian showed us. Their political acts, their refusal of the lines, their community of we, their simultaneous tension and pleasure are evidence of their capacity to redistribute the sensible in their own terms. To think more carefully about possibilities, I turn to another concept from Rancière called ignorance. In his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Rancière says that an emancipatory teacher whose attitude is based on the assumption of an emancipatory teacher is based on the assumption of the equality of intelligence. This is not a matter of knowledge or truth. It is a pedagogical stance that relinquishes the assumption of superior intelligence and creates conditions where learners' own ways of engaging are treated as equally valid. This idea offers a path for adults and institutions, a relinquishing of the assumption of superior knowledge that opens up space for children's own forms of engagement, knowing, and belonging. I wonder if ignorance could move us beyond institutional spaces and orient us toward actively challenging the myths and misconceptions about children so that we resist children becoming particular modes of subjectivity. In other words, ignorance could direct us to turn away from these forms of coerced subjectivity and rather have young children experience a true sense of belonging. For our educators, this could mean, first, challenging spatial restrictions, actively advocating for children's presence in museums rather than absence, and also galleries, parks, and playgrounds and public spaces, not as guests requiring special accommodation, but as rightful participants in cultural life. This includes questioning our own classroom restrictions as well. Who decides where art making happens? What bodies and movements do our spaces prohibit or permit? It could also mean rethinking epistemological restrictions, moving beyond developmental frameworks that categorize and normalize children's expression. This means resisting the urge to interpret children's thinking, making, and doing through adult frameworks, and instead becoming comfortable with the not knowing, a stance that assumes children's equal intelligence while remaining open to meanings that exceed adult comprehension. As Glisson argued, the right to opacity is not a refusal of understanding, but an insistence on dignity. Extending this right to children is a radical act, I believe. In this case of a classroom, I imagine what becomes possible when the teacher practices ignorance, when the adult relinquishes the assumption of knowing what art should look like, and instead attends with curiosity to what children are actually doing. It is my hope that a willingness to dissociate from habitual modes of thinking could allow adults to be surprised and curious about even seemingly mundane events. The small sign I encountered in Seoul has stayed with me not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. A routine piece of institutional language through which a society quietly arranges its priorities. What it told me is what the curfews, the escort policies, the age restrictions, and the stage theories also tell us, that the spaces and frameworks we build for children have always been built, but first and foremost for adults. The work of liberatory childhood art education begins with the willingness to sit with that discomfort, and then to do something different, because ultimately childhood art that is truly about children and their thinking, making, and doing requires adults willing to relinquish control, to create spaces of possibility rather than regimes of restriction. Thank you.